Hey everyone, Dead by Daylight started out as a relatively small game with a unique yet simple gameplay loop. Over the years and with a ton of new releases, it's slowly grown into what many now describe as the Hall of Fame of horror. With the game's near 9-year lifespan though, and onboarding of so many licenses, it has changed a lot in this time. I was told by someone recently that Dead by Daylight is losing its identity. It got me thinking, well, what even is that? What is Dead by Daylight's identity, and is it really losing it? At its core, the game is still the same. Compare gameplay from 2016 to 2025, and really you can see it's the same thing. It's a lot more sharp and crisp nowadays, with a bit more flair, but the gameplays don't look all too dissimilar. The core of gameplay is still the same too. Killers go for hooks, survivors do gens, it's not that different. You earn blood points, you level up, and you continue the cycle. The question more so therefore comes down to licenses and original chapters for the game. Licenses being externally licensed content being introduced into Dead by Daylight's universe, such as Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Evil Dead, or Halloween. Originals being original creations made by the developers specifically for Dead by Daylight, and there's always been some contention here. Some believe licenses are the greatest thing in the world, providing player influxes, a lot more hype or community excitement, unique opportunities to play characters from other games inside of the Dead by Daylight universe, and introducing Dead by Daylight players to other horror media. Originals, on the other hand, are typically favoured for their freedom of creativity with powers, abilities, and design, their fleshed out lore compared to the much smaller licensed entries, ease of changing the character in later updates, and higher number of cosmetics and unique cosmetics. So there's positives for each, and it's generally not agreed upon in the slightest which is better. When it comes to the frequency of each, it's rather balanced too. The game has released 34 chapters and 7 half chapters. In total, 21 of these are original and 20 are licensed. So you can see there's actually quite a split nowadays when it comes to these numbers, with chapter 35 being slated as a license also, followed by a half chapter original and then a chapter 36 license. This will mean licenses will overtake the amount of original chapter content this year for the second time in the game's history, the first being in the very early days in 2017. This is definitely something that has been happening more presently in the last few years too, with quite a high license density. This for many is sort of tough because licenses aren't everyone's thing, especially if they aren't from big franchises or something more widely known or loved, and some that have been debated as to not even be horror. Horror has always been a key feature of Dead by Daylight, and one of its core genres, and with its role as the Horror Hall of Fame, it does have a sort of responsibility almost to introduce new licensed content fairly frequently to retain that title. But how far does this go? And where does it go too far? One key issue many have with licenses now and the future of licenses in Dead by Daylight is that there aren't many big ones left. We now have many of the colossal names that were once dreamt of for the game. We have all the worldwide horror stars, at least most of them. So now it becomes a sort of challenge to find what else to fit in. Do you go the route of more specific horror, or smaller horror communities? Do you go for properties debated as horror at all? Do you aim for more modern popular horror titles? Or do you try to focus on original creations and their addition to the game? All have their merits, and I would argue all have seen some success in recent years. Originals in recent years, I would argue, have been struggling a bit though. Houndmaster released with a number of quite bad bugs, and she was left broken for a decent amount of time. Unknown was a clear positive on the other hand, with an interesting power and fantastic marketing campaign. Singularity was released terribly weak and overly complicated. Skull Merchant is still widely hated and the most hated character in Dead by Daylight's history, and Night is largely forgotten, and also released with quite a dull power. Original releases, I would argue, have had a rough time over the past few years, where licenses seem to have been a lot smoother. This isn't to say the licensed content is better than the original content, simply that it's felt more polished, I suppose. Licenses in general have seemed to have been at the forefront, with us additionally getting 3 licensed survivors in half chapters across the last couple years too. It feels like an overload of licensed content, eclipsing that of the original. This is where it goes even further though. In recent years we've had introductions of new modes and modifiers to the game. Lights Out, Chaos Shuffle, and 2v8 to name the core 3 so far. In recent times, and with the second iterations of these modes, we've seen these turn into licensed events. Castlevania lights out, D&D Chaos Shuffle, Resident Evil 2v8. We then have licensed content creeping into tomes with licensed tome cosmetics, cosmetic collections, licensed lore, and more. Things begin to feel less like Dead by Daylight and more like these other properties. Granted, this is just one perspective, and isn't one, to be honest, I entirely agree with. I don't think it's quite as sinister or insidious as it can be made to sound, like a deadly wave sweeping out the original aspects of the game. There is still plenty when it comes to original content, and so the identity of Dead by Daylight, if we see it as the original content and as the original universe, is still very much intact. But I do agree it can feel like a lot, especially with these licensed events appearing recently. Where does it end ultimately? Will we get license-themed anniversaries in the future? Licensed Halloween events? Fully licensed tomes? A full year of licenses? It all sounds a bit silly now, but did you expect to see so much of this just a few years ago even? So what's the solution here? Should there even be one? As established earlier on, Dead by Daylight has always been a game filled with licenses. Since its inception, it's relied on them to some extent, and its universe has been built with them in mind. The entity's realm, after all, the core of the game's lore, is established to allow anything from any universe to exist or happen within it. A clever idea to make sure anything introduced in lore or gameplay does fit the vibe of the game. This does have some restrictions, of course, as a completely unrelated license to horror likely wouldn't make too much sense being in the game, like a Minecraft license for example. For the most part though, it does mean there is creative freedom for almost anything or anyone to exist in the realm of the entity. To prove this, the biggest controversy over someone fitting in the game was probably Trickster. And he's a relatively grounded character too, with just a splash of colour that usually throws people off. No matter what's happened over the years, everything currently present in the game has managed to find its place and fit in. This includes originals and licenses, even those that many believed wouldn't work or fit in well. So are these really disrupting Dead by Daylight's identity? Well, maybe not with their presence, but debatably with their abundance. Original content and characters are equally core to Dead by Daylight's world and realm, and are the core in a sense. Whilst it would be interesting to see a version of Dead by Daylight where only the licensed content existed, this wouldn't be Dead by Daylight. A core facet of the game is its originality and its original presentations of horror, and even its own takes on existing horror characters, such as Billy being an original Bubba, Trapper being an original Jason, or Legion being an original Ghostface. The wider world established by the core and original characters are what makes Dead by Daylight Dead by Daylight. Remove all the licenses from Dead by Daylight and you have Dead by Daylight still, but remove all the originals and you have a completely different game in feel and function. Dead by Daylight needs to keep its originality in order to function properly, is how I would phrase it. It needs these influxes of content that is wholly its own. Whilst this content may not be as favoured or as hyped, it's much like repeatedly strengthening the foundation, instead of continually trying to add blocks to the top of the tower. Whilst it's a lot more fun to see that license roster grow, and to see your new favourite horror character get placed into the trials, it's just as important that the foundation and the core of the game is tended to and kept up, to make sure it remains looking like a tower, and not just a pile of licenses. The game already has sort of a problem with its content overabundance. There's so much to handle and take care of, and yet it keeps getting added to. I do think this affects the identity of the game, with many original releases often getting sidelined for quite some time. Skull Merchant, for example, for the first time in the game's history, has seemingly been nerfed down to oblivion to stop people playing her, whilst they work on a fix for her power. This could be months to maybe over a year, who knows. Twins took multiple years to get a rework, and most of it was reverted. Characters like Hag have barely been touched since they released, and a bunch of characters simply have glaring flaws in their powers, like Dredge having barely any lockers to teleport to, depending on the map. And of course the most recent case of Houndmaster releasing in quite a bad state, leading to a lot of community upset. It's becoming a real problem, I think, especially as many of the characters having these issues are original ones, leaving Dead by Daylight's identity further marred, with some of them even feeling like the developers want to partially erase them from existence for the time being. Maybe this is just a product of the times, the current times when licensed content is particularly prevalent. It hasn't always been this way though. Years have passed passed with far more original content, and years have passed with a heavier license weighting, but it does feel more than ever that Dead by Daylight is slowly losing a part of itself in a way, a part of its identity, that is in part licenses, but not entirely licenses. Something that has come from wanting the game to continually stay exciting and fresh with content, but maybe not always considering the wider perspective, the people who love the game for its core universe and characters. I'm not in entire agreement either way, to be honest. I feel a bit of both when it comes to my feelings surrounding the game's identity. Part of me loves the constant licensed content and how much of it is accessible nowadays, but another part does miss the greater creativity and freedom of original content, as well as its presence that contributes to the game's core world. I hope I could give a good argument regardless for why this sentiment of the game's identity being lost is on the rise, a combination of a number of factors, but in large part because of the game's ever-increasing rise of content and load, and for the seeming perpetual increase of licensed content in-game, as well as the fact that licenses have recently taken more of an off-road approach, where we're getting licenses from more niche horror IPs, and some debatably non-horror ones too. All of it comes together to create this feeling of something feeling a bit off with the game, whether this is true or not. Dead by Daylight has always had a variety of issues, and strengths at a variety of points, but I do think this balance has forever been somewhat sacred between originals and licenses, a thing that needs to be kept in check to some degree, and has recently fallen a little out of balance. Thanks, and goodbye.